In the 15th century, Italy was home to a creative upsurge that redefined Western art ideals.
This dome, the Santa Maria del Fiore, which in its day was the largest dome on Earth, has long been a symbol of the Italian Renaissance.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge.
I know what it feels like to be at the center of a creative revolution. That's me with Grandmaster Flash. I was producing music, making art, and producing films in the early days of our Renaissance.
It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
I'm talking about the ghetto streets of New York City in the late 70s and early 80s. We had no rich patrons to bankroll us, nor the blessings of the Pope. We were the disruptive, defiant pioneers of hip-hop culture and street art.
It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
That spirit and energy spread like a wildfire across the entire world. There were new and diverse voices, and the world of music has never been the same. If you want to take a fresh look at 15th century Renaissance art in Italy, why not travel around in 15th century style? Fab, the Harlem Cowboy, I'm coming to town to check it all out. There were powerful patrons such as the Medicis and rock star artists such as Michelangelo. Since my childhood in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, I've enjoyed visiting museums and seeing great art. But nothing compares to being in Florence for the first time.
Not only were Renaissance artists making art that defined high aesthetic ideals, but they were also groundbreaking in showing a ethnically diverse, racially mixed Italy in the 15th and 16th century. You just have to look at the art. Wow, look at this. You know, this hitch, this has been here since the 15th century. Since the days of Michelangelo, Vasari, any of them cats could have tied their horse right here. That's how we doing it, right, girl? Come on.
I'm on my way to visit one of the most mind-blowing basilicas in Florence.
Yo, we in the Basilica di Santa Croce. This is like the Hall of Fame of Renaissance masters up in this piece. Over there is Galileo. Church was real mad at him because he proved that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the solar system. Over there, Tupac's man, Machiavelli, master political intrigue, he laying over there. And most importantly, the Michael Jackson of the Renaissance, Michelangelo. He's laying up in here too. They laid Michelangelo out real sweet here in Santa Croce. He rests in peace for real. But the main reason why I came is to check out another major early Renaissance game changer, Giotto.
Giotto was doing his thing more than 100 years before Michelangelo and broke out with a more naturalistic style, which shook up all the artists that came after him, including Michelangelo.
This right here is Giotto's early masterpiece, Trial by Fire. It's a fresco, some of it's falling apart. It's one of the earliest depictions of Africans in a Renaissance work of art, Italian Renaissance.
It's from the early 1300s and shows Saint Francis meeting a sultan in North Africa. Francis is prepared to walk through fire in a dare to prove that Christianity is superior to Islam.
It's all in his plan of universal church. I think the church in that period They want that all people become Christian. They want power.
It's a fascinating work. It's perhaps the first European painting of Africans in which they are represented with full naturalism. They're dressed in Islamic robes, and there's a group of bearded white men, also in Islamic dress, who presumably are about to be asked to walk through the fire too. They run away. But the two African figures in white robes are presented like the Sultan as somebody who is looking and trying to make a decision between the two faiths.
Giotto is not only groundbreaking by including some Africans, he's showing them as having a mind of their own when it comes to religion.
So here you can see the difference. Now this piece was painted 100 years before Giotto's version, but this is that same story, that same myth, that same narrative. These are Africans, and the Catholic cat right here is trying to convert them. Personally, they don't look like they going for it. People are all stacked on top of each other. Painting was not yet able to give us perspective and to create depth within the pieces. And Giotto helped push painting in that direction. Giotto brought narrative, he brought dynamism, he brought that naturalistic flavor, you know, and he was able to tell a story all in one picture.
It was very cool to see how Giotto placed Africans within Christian mythology. I'm now heading to the heart of divine inspiration in 15th century Florence, the bronze doors of the baptistry. They've been viewed by millions, but I think still have a secret to tell.
These are the doors created by Lorenzo Ghiberti. This is one of the most iconic works in the history of the Italian Renaissance.
The commission was won in 1401 by Ghiberti. He came up with an entirely new way to cast bronze. It took him 21 years to finish up 28 panels. Each panel is part of a story about the life of Jesus.
Back in this days, this was like 3D and beyond. This was a blockbuster illustration of the story of the biblical myth.
The detail and action in each panel is just incredible. Christ arriving in Jerusalem, the expulsion of the money changers from the temple, the baptism of Christ.
The panel that I came here to really check out closely is this one right here. The Adoration of the Magi. It's the story of the three kings coming to see the baby Jesus. If you take a close look in the upper left-hand corner, look at my man right here. His features look to be those of an African. There's a little monkey on his shoulder.
He may not be one of the three kings, but he's part of the entourage and definitely in on the action.
The fact that there's an African in one of the most important Renaissance works, you would think that's something most people would know about.
The African man in Ghiberti's sculpture is so amazing. I think it's the first sculpture of African presence in Renaissance art, in Italian Renaissance art.
It's undoubtedly one of the most famous works of Italian art of all time. There's no question at a certain point that the church totally got behind the idea of a black man in the adoration story.
The monkey, is it symbolic of the monkey on one's back?
Probably not in the way that we use the phrase today. When they showed members of the Three Kings entourage, the emphasis was often on the distant lands which they ruled over. And so exotic animals like leopards or camels or monkeys were often represented. This was a work that was designed in the early 1400s. But in Florence at this time, nobody chose to represent one of the three kings as an African.
Okay.
That had still not yet happened. That was in the future.
When these doors went up, it was beyond a sensation.
I think this African man was the first Afro-Italian. It's wonderful.
When the Ghiberti doors were first commissioned, the cathedral right next to it was still missing its dome. But a radical new era, which was beginning to reflect the diversity of the world, would soon receive its crown jewel. The Santa Maria del Fiore was intended to have the world's biggest dome, but its construction began a century before the engineering know-how existed to pull it off.
So after about 100 years of a cathedral with a gaping hole where a dome was intended, the embarrassment was just too much. Plus, it used to rain in here. I mean, for 100 years, rain. They had to do something.
Church officials would take one of the biggest architectural gambles in history and give a brash former goldsmith named Filippo Brunelleschi a job. Not surprisingly, the upstart Brunelleschi had no shortage of jealous rivals and hostile skeptics.
A director of the cathedral, Giovanni Di Gerardo, wrote a widely circulated sonnet dissing Brunelleschi, saying his plan was delusional and very dangerous. Brunelleschi, he wasn't having it. He came back with his own sonnet, because he could give as good as he got, okay? Brunelleschi was like, up yours. Essentially, the equivalent of a 15th century rap battle.
Fonte fonda, messa di ignoranza. Son certo di tua mente fola che poco sai dir fiamente essere. Ma se tu badalon che in acqua vola, viene a perfezione che non può essere. Non ti dilega Dante nella scuola.
Ogni falso pensiero non vede l'essere che l'arte dà quando l'arte vola.
Ragione non dà che la cosa impossibile possibile facci uomo, sino sostanza.
Falso giudizio perde la baldanza, che esperienza gli si fa terribile. Adunque i versi tuoi convienti stessere, che hanno rugato in falso la carola, da poi che il mio è impossibile, viene all'essere.
Ti ho fatto fuori. Ciao ciao.
Brunelleschi may have won the rap battle and been a fly architect, but he was very uncool when it came to workers' rights.
You know, I could only think of the workers that climbed this thing 600 years ago.
At one point, hundreds of dome workers had to swallow a 50% pay cut. And when they went out on strike demanding a pay raise, they were replaced by scabs.
This is the real deal Stairmaster. Renaissance style.
From one of the most famous domes in the world to one of the most famous museums in the world. It's a short ride to the Uffizi. There's no shortage of Renaissance masterpieces in the Uffizi. This masterpiece is by Titian from the rival city of Venice. He really went out on a limb with this painting, The Venus of Urbino.
Back in this day, a very controversial painting. Titian was not afraid to push the limits.
It almost got him excommunicated from the Catholic Church. But the painting I came to the Uffizi to see was also groundbreaking in its day, around 1460. It's another adoration of the Magi story, and the Catholic Church appeared to be going out on the limb.
And this is one of my favorite paintings. Scenes from the Life of Christ by Andrea Mantegna. And this is one of the major early Florentine stories of the three kings coming to see the baby Christ. But notice the brothers depicted in this picture.
An African is not just an extra on set, he's been promoted to king. And this is possibly the first African king to star in an Italian painting as one of the Magi.
The Black King right here, my man got his whole posse with him. Camels, elaborate garb. Whether my man got some frankincense, some myrrh, some good cannabis, I really don't know for sure, but he's got a gold vessel in his hand. He's bowing down, he's paying homage. This is the story Montaigne wanted you to know.
The story of the wise men was always about how Christianity was foreordained to be a global religion.
So, you know, I went to Catholic school in Brooklyn, so the three kings and the fact that one of them was black, that was big.
The fact is that the Bible doesn't really specify anything about the ethnic character of the three kings, and it actually takes more than 1,000 years until we begin to see one of these three wise men represented as an African in the 1300s in Germany.
So Germans kind of introduce a brother into the picture.
Yes.
And then essentially that becomes a standard thing.
Right. Then in the next 150 years or so, this character, the Black African wise man, spreads to almost every corner of European art.
The theme of the Black King was really pushed by the church. Hundreds of adoration paintings in Italy and across Europe would include a black king or wise man paying respect to the baby Jesus. It was part of a campaign to win over Africans and convert non-Christians on all continents.
Myth-making at its finest right here.
One of the fascinating things about that painting was that the Magi has a particular prepossession of, and feeling, you can feel the royalness of him in the painting and his devotion. And there were many other people of color in that painting, and they looked different one to another.
Right.
These are all individualized faces. It means that these individuals were there in Italy to make this painting. This was a very complex world that we really have not looked at.
People always think in Italian in a stereotypical way. No black people, no Arabs, no Muslims. But the black presence was a reality of Renaissance period. And Montaigne or other painters showed this in their painting.
The Medici tag can be seen almost everywhere in Florence. After a tough day running a banking empire or pulling the strings of political power, the Medicis would polish their image by commissioning great art. Here at the Palazzo Medici, there's a private chapel with a fresco commissioned by Piero de' Medici.
Ah, here we go. So this is Procession of the Magi, painted by Benozzo Gozzoli. And everybody here is wearing their finest threads, the gold, everything is glittering and gleaming.
Procession is a very trendy biblical story. But Cosimo de' Medici, the family patriarch, insisted on putting himself in this holy scene. That's a portrait of the banker right there.
The Medici family wanted you to know that they were down in the central part of this picture, but also they included a lot of their allies and people that were tight with the family were all featured in this particular part of the picture here. But what we have right here is the main interest to me. This brother right here, this black man, is featured prominently in the piece. He's an archer. But who was he? Why was he so close to the crew? Was he security? Was he like tight with Cosimo and the crew? You could see the detail in his face. It was clearly modeled from someone that really did exist.
I think there must have been a little life drawing session going on here. Many of the figures in this cycle of paintings we know to be portraits of living individuals. And right in the foreground on one of the walls is this superbly painted figure of an African man, an archer, holding a bow and arrow. It's hard to imagine that this figure is anything other than a portrait of an African who was actually in Florence in the period.
It's fascinating the amount of detail in everybody's face, particularly the brother. He got the low-cut fro, and he got the mismatched tights on, and tights a different color. I'm not quite clear on what the symbolism of that is. The cat, almost on the opposite side of him, he's got the mismatched tights on too. He got a long dagger in his hand. So these cats very well could have been head of security for the Medici clan. You know, his bow and arrow game had to be top-notch to be featured like that.
In the Renaissance period, we know that Africans were known for their military prowess. They're described as particularly valiant or courageous in battle.
You know, I can't help but wonder if this black archer in the Renaissance might have faced the same type of racism that a black person might face today.
In 15th century, the Italian general didn't think themselves in racial terms. No white people. Of course, different from African or Arabs, but I think more like related to the city. Florentines or Venetian or Roman. Above all, the Christians. Race is a modern concept.
Many people in this fresco have been identified by art historians. But the identity of the archer, one of the most prominent figures, seems to have fallen through the art historical cracks.
Clearly, there are representations of Africans in Renaissance art, but all these people were invisible to the art historical record because they were not considered the important reason for looking at the paintings. And so none of these people are discussed or even, rarely mentioned. They are invisible. Africans are invisible in plain sight.
When people think of Renaissance Italy, they probably don't think of African archers. They're more likely to think of Michelangelo. But they're not likely to think of Michelangelo getting down as a street artist.
So legend has it that Michelangelo carved this little piece of graffiti in stone right here on the side of Palazzo Vecchio building. Renaissance street art, graffiti in full effect.
Clearly, Michelangelo was doing a lot more than tagging up the walls graffiti style. It's mind-blowing to have Michelangelo's David all to myself.
Wow, so this is definitely one of Michelangelo's greatest hits. Many feel his greatest. You know that story, David and Goliath? This looks like a Goliath to me here, gigantic. David, bigger than Goliath. That's really what's going on here. I mean, who's the biggest and the baddest? And the coolest. And this became a huge symbol for the people of Florence, where it was outside originally for a really long time. And they brought him in out of the elements. Yeah. I guess if this is outside, it also could be termed street art, but clearly a masterpiece. Vasari basically said, there doesn't need to be any more sculptures, essentially. He said, this is it right here. It's a very cool pose, to be specific. You know, the way my man is just nonchalantly standing there, butt naked. Can somebody give me a fig leaf so I can hook my man up? But the real reason I came here are to look at what some consider Michelangelo's slave sculptures. So this piece is referred to as the bearded slave. Michelangelo often talked about freeing the figure from the stone, from the marble, reveal the figure out of the stone. It's also debatable whether or not this piece and several others in this group were actually finished. These almost could be looked at as Michelangelo's conceptual works if in fact he did leave them like this intentionally to kind of give you a look at his process. You almost can feel the movement in his form struggling to emerge from this rock. You know, the feeling that I get as an artist myself, I just want to borrow a hammer and chisel and help my man Mike out, because I could tap out a little more, my man, just to bring him more into focus.
In addition to the bearded slave, there are 3 other Michelangelo slave sculptures at the Accademia in Florence. There's the young slave, the awakening slave, and the Atlas slave. They were originally made for the tomb of a pope, Julius II, back in the early 16th century.
Because of the history that many of us are aware of, we tend to associate slavery in these times with Africa. But if you look at the features, he doesn't look African. That's because the African slave trade hadn't really jumped off yet. Nor is slavery something we associate with the time of the Renaissance. In Florence and in Italy at that time, there was slavery. Very little of it was African slavery. Like if one country conquered another, the defeated people, they became slaves.
Black slaves in that time is not too much. But it's interesting to see the mix. For example, Greeks, Arabs, Turkish, and black people have in common this horrible slavery. They use in the houses, above all women.
There's such high ideals around the ideas of the Renaissance and Florentine culture, it's often not talked about that there was slavery going on.
The Medici own slaves. Medici men have children with enslaved women. This is a part of the Medici story that isn't typically discussed.
Slavery is baked into the fabric of Italian urban life in this period. The number of slaves, the percentage of the slave population in these Italian cities is 5% or less. And when we look at and admire Italian Renaissance art, we have to understand that slavery and the results of slavery are part of what it presents to us.
If you don't want to look at one of the most famous Renaissance artworks, which may have been paid for by the slave trade, look away now.
Mona Lisa's husband was a slave trader.
The links between slavery and Italian Renaissance art lead me to Venice, which for centuries was the center for international trade.
This busy area right here along this promenade is known as the Riva delle Schiavone. Translation, waterfront of Slavs. Slavs as in the root word of slavery. For a long time, slaves were brought here primarily from Eastern Europe, which is way out over there, not too far, and this is where slaves were brought. I thought you were a gondolier for a minute. I want a discount ride.
I'm on my way by foot to the Accademia Gallery in Venice. I want to check out some paintings from the late 15th century. It was a time when the slave trade was already having an impact on Venetian culture. A visit to the Accademia Gallery is like time traveling back to Venice 500 years ago. There's one room filled with massive paintings. They feature a cast of hundreds with countless intricate details of the Venetian hood.
Wow. This is amazing. This painting from 1494 by Vittore Carpaccio is a dynamic scene of Venice with lots of people, but center in the image is this black gondolier. Really amazing. He's the center of the picture, essentially.
I love Carpaccio. He's one of the most interesting painters of that period because all the people thinking Raphael, Michelangelo, of course they are so great, but Carpaccio showed the life of Venice of that period.
For me right here, especially with the scale, this is a major motion picture for that day. We got people moving around like across the bridge, people back, forward, but front and center is the black gondolier, the star of the show. Like really amazing. And it just lets you know that there was some diversity going on in Venice as well. But I want to know who this guy is. Like, what's his story? Could he have been a slave, a servant, a free man? He could be the owner of a gondolier company for all I know, because he's really well dressed. And I like what he's wearing, by the way. It's kind of fly. I mean, the whole neck situation, the scarf, you know, the feather in the hat, you know, the tights, the patterns, really interesting piece. And you know, also, he's not the only black gondolier in this picture. If you see over here, there's another brother. I'm gonna need to jump into this painting and really walk around and talk to some people and really get a sense of what's happening here.
Now we are in the little canals near Rialto Bridge, and we'll be on the south side of the Rialto Bridge, and we can manage to get the same point of view of the Carpaccio miracle in Rialto.
That's amazing. To see, that's amazing. The movie comes to life. The Carpaccio movie comes to life.
Francesco da Mosto was born in Venice, and his ancestors have lived in Venice and navigated its canals since the days of Carpaccio in the 15th century.
Ah, the Grand Canal coming up.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So I think this is nearly the perfect position that we have is like in the painting
Carpaccio
of the Carpaccio, in the miracle of Rialto.
Right here.
Yeah, here the bridge was in wood. All the people on the side with the arches.
Wow.
On the background there was the house of my family.
I'm amazed that the home of Francesco's ancestors actually appears in the painting by Carpaccio.
Wow.
And in front of us, where the Vaporetto is coming, there was the black gondolier coming to us.
Amazing, like he was right here.
Yeah. I think it's one of the most Venetian iconic paintings. Something that you see once, you don't forget it.
This is fantastic.
It's about 15 minutes by Francesco's boat, weaving around tourists and gondolas to get to his home in Venice. There was a lot more he wanted to tell me about one of his ancestors and his possible connection to the painting by Carpaccio.
And this was your ancestor?
Yeah. This is Alvise da Mosto.
Okay.
He was in 1450.
Ah.
So it was 50 years before Colombo. He was just 22 years old. During a storm, he discovered Cape Verde Islands.
And Cape Verde, I've been there. That's right off the coast of West
Seneca.
Africa.
That's right.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And he was working for the Portuguese. Come in.
Oh, man. Whoa. Wait, I know I asked you before, but you live here?
I was born here, yeah, so I couldn't touch anything. I think it's here in this map, you can see the two journeys of Alvise da Mosto.
Oh, that's what those lines are.
Exactly.
Ah.
This one, he started from Portugal because he was paid by the Portuguese to go to search for gold and salt and slaves.
I see.
He went all south, and it's quite interesting because there, when he goes in the river Gambia, he found some black people that they're rowing in the Venetian way.
Really?
Yeah.
So a possibility that some of those people at some point were brought. Did your relative actually have slaves? Was he involved in the slave trade?
Surely I found some documents that there is a market of slavery.
Ah.
Because there was an edit by the Pope at the I think 1450, 1454, the Pope made a law in which the Portuguese could do the trade of people, that they were not Christians. If that black rowing man in the Carpaccio painting is connected to my ancestral visa, I cannot prove it, but it's quite interesting that he described with his words people rowing there and that he got some slaves there.
Wow. So what does that say about who the black gondolier could have been?
I think he was a servant of a noble family, so they dress him very well. They like him to be dressed very well. And to be really in center of the painting, I think that in the idea of Carpaccio was that in front of God we are all equal, something like that.
This gondolier is so beautiful, and with this wonderful dress, is good looking. He had a dagger. The dagger is not for slaves, it's for free men.
Not far from the home of Francesco is the Basilica dei Frari. It contains a huge monument to Renaissance superstar and Venetian, the painter Titian. The Basilica is also home to one of Titian's most famous religious paintings, The Assumption. But there's another painting by Titian, a private commission, which fascinates me. It's a portrait of an aristocrat named Laura Diante with a black child, her page.
Titian moved from Venice to go to Ferrara, where they did that painting. When Laura Diante had been painting with the black, it's marvelous. She wanted that because she wanted to show off. I think that was very fashionable for these noble women to have black people with them.
It's something related with power, something related with the position of Laura Diante in the society of that time. Now the people buy diamonds. In that period, buy a black child. It's quite hard for us because I was a black child.
Who do you think the young page was? Do you have any ideas of who that black child really could have been?
There was a whole African family, we know, living in Ferrara at this time, who had been contracted to come live there. The father had been a gondolier in Venice.
While there's no proof, it's amazing to think there may be a connection between a black gondolier in a painting by Carpaccio and the child in the painting by Titian.
This black child maybe is related with the gondolier of Carpaccio. Maybe it's one of his son. I don't know really. But used in other paintings, the black children were slaves. They made contracts to buy from other family or for slave traders these children.
It does seem to be the first example of showing a upper-class European in a portrait attended upon by a young African child.
So this was the one that started the whole trend of the black page?
It totally kicks it off. In Germany, in France, in Italy, even in Russia, this became more and more fashionable over hundreds of years.
The Titian child was the birth of a racial stereotype. It was part of a Renaissance mix. Some art boldly reflected racial and ethnic diversity. Works by Carpaccio and others became a source of Afro-Venetian pride. But as the African slave trade took root, things would take a much darker turn, and the representation of Africans would be distorted for centuries to come. Back in the same basilica where you'll find the Titian masterpiece, you'll also find a tomb to a powerful Venetian politician, Doge Giovanni Pesaro. It's from the 17th century, more than 100 years after the Titian portrait with the black page. Those figures along the top are supposed to represent religion and valor and justice with unity. What holds it all up? 4 African slaves. We weren't allowed to record any commentary in the basilica, but the tomb made me sick to my stomach. With the Pope's blessing, the African slave trade was really gearing up. Racist ideology to justify slavery was taking hold. And sculptures such as these, made with sections of black stone, would become a new image of the black African.
When I stay in Venice, sometimes I say hello to the 4 poor men of the grave of Doge Pesaro, because for black women like me to see the slaves is quite horrible, because they look so bad, and you think, okay, they are slaves for real. Mediterranean slavery is important because it's something that prepares the Middle Passage from Africa to South and North America during the 17th and 18th century.
Back in the Florentine Renaissance, I haven't come across any black slaves in marble, and ideas about race were still in flux. But artists still made a living by carving tombs for the rich and powerful. Just ask Michelangelo. He spent over 12 years working on tombs for the Medici family. But work on their tombs was interrupted when the power of the Medicis was challenged in the 1520s by a Republican uprising. And Michelangelo was caught in the middle.
So Michelangelo took the Medici's gold for the commission to do the tomb. But he actually was supporting the Republicans, and they were trying to kick the oligarchs out of power. The Medicis were the biggest oligarchs. Michelangelo was kind of playing both sides of the fence right here.
In 1527, a Republican uprising forced the powerful Medicis into exile. This fresco in the Palazzo Vecchio, called the Siege of Florence, says a lot about how the Medicis managed to return to power. They got the backing of Emperor Charles V and his army, which imposed a long and bloody siege. Michelangelo helped defend the city against the emperor's army. When the city fell, he feared for his life.
What did Michelangelo do? He hid, he ran.
Legend has it, Michelangelo hid in a very unlikely place. A secret room below the Medici chapel. The public has never been allowed down here.
Oh, shit.
Michelangelo may have hidden here for weeks. The chamber was covered in coal dust and untouched for hundreds of years.
Yo, this is crazy.
But below the coal dust, Michelangelo definitely left his mark.
Yo, I guess Michael was doing his thing on the walls down here. He was doing graffiti down here, baby. This is priceless work of art. It's on this wall where he hid. He was down here, he was scared, like Mobb Deep shook one, he was shook. He thought the Medicis was gonna get him.
Halfway crooks, scared to death and scared to look. They shook, cause ain't no such thing as halfway crooks.
I could almost see him doing this right here. I need to get a piece of chalk and just tag my name up here. I'm feeling it, baby. Like, it's like, yo.
Check it out now.
And the Medicis ultimately gave him a pass. They forgave him. Because look how nice he was. They were like, yo, we can't kill one of the best artists in our time. Oh, man. These are like the drawings of the statues upstairs that he was carving.
Every man for themselves in his land, we be
So basically what you got going on here is dawn and dusk. And that's Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, in deep thought, chilling. He was one of the Medicis. His remains are in this sarcophagus right here. But also in the sarcophagus is the remains of his son, Alessandro de' Medici. Alessandro was no joke. He ruled Florence for about 4 years. He hung with Vasari. But the most fascinating thing about Alessandro, he was black.
Alessandro is just such an inconvenient piece of Renaissance history for people who just want to talk about the Renaissance as a wonderful and mainly white place.
Alessandro de' Medici. Why don't we know about this guy?
Alessandro's always been there in the footnotes of history. He rules Florence from 1531 to 37. We don't have a lot of solid information about Alessandro's mother. People say that she was mulatto, that she was half Negro, that she was Moorish, that she was a slave. Here we are in this room of Pope Leo X, and all around us we've got these commemorations and celebrations of different members of the Medici family.
When Alessandro came on the scene, the Medicis had already been pulling the strings of power in Florence for about 100 years.
It looks like one happy family.
It looks like one happy family, but they certainly were not. Here's Alessandro in this wonderful classicizing armor. He's got this wonderful helmet with a plume on it.
This portrait of Alessandro happens to be by his childhood friend, Giorgio Vasari. And this is where Alessandro spent that childhood. It's the Medici Villa Poggio a Caiano. It was only a couple of hours outside Florence by horseback.
I don't believe Alessandro would have been close to his mother. I don't believe he really knew who she was.
The villa was built for Alessandro's great-grandfather, Lorenzo the Magnificent.
She was so far removed from the social level of the Medici that apparently she married a coachman and was given her freedom as a result of giving up the child.
Alessandro may have played and took his Latin lessons under this fresco by Renaissance artist Pontormo. Pontormo would also paint several portraits of Alessandro.
I think the best evidence of his African heritage are several of the early portraits we have of Alessandro that suggest to me African features: his curly hair, a wide nose, a broad nose, and large lips.
The nickname of Alessandro de' Medici was Alessandro il Moro, Alessandro the Moor. So the people know that he was black. But I think this is no big deal in that time. Was the difference, but no big deal like today.
In the 16th century, there was not a conception of biological racism as we have today. The more important thing than skin color or cultural traditions was bloodline, particularly aristocratic bloodline.
The continuity of the main Medici bloodline hit a snag when Alessandro was still a child.
Their last legitimate man in the main line of the family dies of syphilis. That's Alessandro's dad.
Alessandro's dad was Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and Alessandro was his only son.
European aristocratic families took very good care of their bastard offspring. They still had that element of royal blood, even if they were not on both sides of the family.
By default, Alessandro was in line for political power when the army of the Holy Roman Emperor kicked the Republicans out of Florence in 1530. This is the Palazzo Vecchio. It's where you have your office if you're the ruler of Florence.
When Alessandro became Duke of Florence, he essentially took it over. After his death, they installed all these different paintings and statues to memorialize the family, including this one here of Alessandro. He's evoking the Roman Empire here. And Alessandro was the first of the dukes who, on the part of the Medici, absolutely ran the show in Florence. On a modern definition of race, you could say Alessandro was the first black head of state in the modern West.
So what kind of leader was Alessandro back in this period?
He's actually quite a populist ruler. So he did things like reintroducing the big horse race, the Palio that runs through the center of Florence. He put on festivals. So he tried to do initiatives that were going to be popular with the people. He tries to keep food prices down. And people, in fact, say that he rules with wisdom and justice.
What was the reaction to the fact that Alessandro was of mixed race? What was that dynamic like back at that time?
People comment on his mother's low status, the fact that she's possibly a slave. In fact, the question of rank and status seems to have bothered them more. There's much more emphasis on that than there is on the color of Alessandro's skin.
The problem of Alessandro de' Medici and in general the black presence in Renaissance world was the historian that came after Alessandro.
In the 19th century, in the context of history of Alessandro, you get people talking about Alessandro as a tyrant and then linking that almost within a sentence to, and just look at him. But interestingly, once you get into the 20th century, you start to get a reclaiming of Alessandro as part of black history. In the 1930s, Arturo Schomburg wrote an article for The Crisis in which he portrays Alessandro as the Negro Medici and makes a claim for this being a positive part of black history.
It's fascinating because that all took place in a time in America when there was something called the Harlem Renaissance, where you had black folks migrating up from the South, feeling a sense of freedom. And there was this great flowering of music and popular culture and painting and writings and things of that nature.
Back in the 1930s, we even had our own black duke who ruled Harlem. His name was Ellington, Duke Ellington. And we had amazing writers such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. And of course, Louis Armstrong.
It was sort of like our Renaissance, but being here, it's like interesting to see the actual Renaissance and to learn more about Alessandro. What was the music he was listening to, you think?
He's bringing in musicians from beyond Italy, from France and Flanders. Composers like Adrian Willits. So he clearly has international musical tastes. And he may also have had an African drummer, nicknamed the Little Moor.
Catherine, given all the rivalries going on in this time, would you say that Alessandro possibly feared for his life?
Alessandro definitely feared for his life. He wore the Renaissance equivalent of a stab vest, this kind of armored doublet with a fine chainmail inside it. He had enemies outside the family, and he had enemies inside the family.
Fearing a local uprising against his rule or a foreign invasion, Alessandro ordered the construction of a massive fortress, and he wanted it built fast. It was named the Fortezza Alessandrina, and it's become Alessandro's most visible legacy in Florence.
It is this huge star-shaped fortress. And this was knocked up at an incredible rate. They got it together in 18 months. And they do that with a workforce of thousands. This place would have been filled with troops, with a garrison to defend Alessandro's regime. So the part of the fortress that we're standing in has these posts for cannon to shoot out. But think about it, these are pointing at the city, not away from the city. If the Medici had to flee from Florence, this was perfectly located because straight down that road, that leads to their palace, it leads to the Duomo, to the Palazzo Vecchio past it. So it's all in one big straight line. But the fortress really couldn't save Alessandro from an inside job by a member of his own court who he had trusted.
On January 6, 1537, Alessandro was lured to a bedroom with the promise of a hot date. It was a booty call, arranged by his cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici. With his defenses down and his protective garments off, Lorenzino and an accomplice pounced on Alessandro and stabbed him to death. Within days, Lorenzino was bragging he killed his cousin Alessandro for the sake of the Republic.
Alessandro was 25 when he was assassinated. Lorenzino wanted to be the new Brutus, stabbing Julius the tyrant.
That's Julius, as in Julius Caesar, the guy who wanted to abolish the Roman Republic, but was assassinated by those he trusted, his homies. Writing as an American in the 1930s, Arturo Schomburg was most surprised that Alessandro was probably bumped off as a result of Renaissance skullduggery and not by an act of racial hatred.
Now, in Italy, the people think in color of skin, but it's so amazing and so powerful when we see the painting and the sculpture of Renaissance world. These paintings and this sculpture talk to us to another possibility.
Great Renaissance artists did what great artists always do: see the world with fresh eyes. For me, they left some amazing snapshots of a world with more diversity than I imagined, and which defied racial stereotypes along the way. A lot of flavor, straight out of Florence.
Hey, Palomo, you ready to come to Harlem with me? You ready to come to New York? Palomo? And ride around Central Park? You ready? Come on.
This picture of you, bro. People gonna be like, what?
People learn a little bit more about the Renaissance.
There you go.
Ciao, ciao.